Now, the next, also iatrogenic problem, which I'll close with, is the compulsive behaviors, impulse control disorders they call them, but they're really compulsive behaviors. You've heard of people who take dopamine agonists. So those are pramipreksol, rotigotine, the Nupro patch, and ropinirol, Requip. So Mirapex, Requip, rotigotine patch are the drugs that are primarily implicated in this. And it was discovered only after the drugs had been in use for 20 years, because who would connect a patient who's gambling with a drug that they'd been taking for 5 years? I mean, who would make that connection? But that connection was made, and it turns out to be accurate. Let me see, can we play that video? So first of all, I'd like to thank both of you for agreeing to this interview and for allowing me to show it at in front of doctors and other health professionals. So first I'm going to start with your daughter to describe what she went through with this problem with the gambling, okay? And then I'm going to ask you to say a few words too.
My father's had Parkinson's for over 10 years. At the beginning, we were finding that he was spending unnecessary money. It has led to us taking over his finances. He has totally wiped out his life earnings, which was about over $250,000, with visa bills over $25,000 that had to be repaid. Now he's only allowed so much money per week. And with this, as soon as he gets money in his possession, he will spend it on things, like food and everything, but he will also lie and spend it on scratch tickets, which he claims is not a form of gambling. It's just a few tickets. And when asked about his life savings, he will say that he doesn't cry over spilt milk. And just yesterday, he said that he took $25 out of the bank. I asked him what it was for. He told me it was for dry cleaning. When I asked his help what the $25 was for, did he pick up dry cleaning? He knew nothing about that. And then my father admitted that he spent the $25 on scratch tickets. So this is just one of the thousands of examples how he continues to lie about how he uses the money that we give him and allow to him.
And he didn't have a gambling problem before the Parkinson's?
Absolutely not. In
Right.
fact, when he used to go to Atlantic City a few times with our mother, he used to get angry when my mother used to play the nickel machines.
Okay.
And then he used to gamble a few games of baseball, but that was like a neighborhood pool but it was never ever as much as bad as this.
Okay. Well, thank you. And what's your take on this?
Well, I must admit that once I started with the Mirapex,
Yeah.
my gambling habits became very attractive.
And what do you see? How do you see it now? I mean, your daughter says it's still happening.
I'm not gambling that much money.
Yeah.
I do buy a scratch ticket. I do play the lottery when the earnings are when the winnings are like $100 million.
Yeah.
Play the lottery.
Do you think she's exaggerating?
She's exaggerating.
Yeah. But you did lose all your life savings, right?
It wasn't $250,000.
But it was a lot of
I
money.
had $125,000 in my bank.
But you lost that.
I lost that.
Okay. So that's still a lot of money, I think,
Yes,
right? Okay.
I'm very sorry I lost that.
Sure.
And
But what about the $25 you spent yesterday?
$25 I spent yesterday. I spent $15. So I had gone into a Chubby's shack and I had fish and chips.
Okay, so this was a man who was single. His wife had died a while back, and his 2 adult daughters were taking care of him and controlled his money. And so he was on an allowance, and he would go to his family members, his cousins, and say that his daughters were stealing his money and that he needed money from them because he couldn't eat otherwise. Meanwhile, they, of course, were controlling his money as best they could. And, as he said, he didn't lose $250,000, he only lost $125,000. So it was no big deal, despite the fact that he no longer had a retirement. And he was a guy who did not gamble previously. So this is an extreme example of the kind of problem that occurs sometimes with these drugs, with people who had previously normal behavior starting to do something compulsively. And you've probably all heard about the gambling and the hypersexuality, but there are a number of other things where people do very unusual and highly focused activities on a very compulsive basis. So one of my colleagues had a patient, for example, who couldn't stop eating Braeburn apples. I actually had never heard of Braeburn apples, but there is a species of Braeburn apples. She gained 20 pounds eating Braeburn apples. And when she stopped taking the medication, she lost the weight and stopped eating apples. I've had patients who did compulsive hobbies. So one guy who couldn't stop fishing. He was an avid fisherman before this, but then he started doing things that were really crazy, like fishing off the rocks during the winter, in New England, things that were really insane, that he only recognized as being crazy after he stopped taking the medication. I had a patient who baked a cherry pie every night, and he didn't like cherry pies, and he didn't eat them. So people can do unusual things, and one of the interesting things about this is it doesn't develop right away. It's something that develops after patients have been on the drugs for quite some period of time. So one of my patients recently told me, she said, you keep asking me about whether I'm doing anything compulsively. She said, well, recently I noticed that when I go to work in the morning that I have to change my clothes. That no matter what I put on, I have to change them 2 or 3 times till I find an outfit that I think is right. And she never used to do this. And we cut down her drug, it went away.